Beginning a new series in the morning, which we're calling No Excuses. And the conviction that we've got about this series is this, that if you want your life as a Christian to work, actually, if you want life to work, then you and we all have to drop the excuses we make before God about the various different subjects that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks and actually embrace what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to drop the excuses and obey what God says. And we're going to start with the very first excuse anyone in the Bible ever offered to God. The first one. It's the one which probably lies just underneath every other excuse that people ever make. It wasn't my fault. It was someone else's fault. I didn't really do it. Someone else is the problem here. And we're going to see that if we drop that excuse and actually own our own actions. So if we put our hand up and say, yeah, that was me, that's who I am, then what we're going to see is, first of all, that if we do own our own actions and we drop the excuses as to why we don't obey God, it should first of all devastate us. It should devastate us. But actually, that's the first step into moving into real life and a life that works. Life as it's meant to be. Life without fear, life without regret, life without shame. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want a life without shame? I know I'd want it. And so what we're going to do, we're going to begin in the Garden of Eden. And where we're going to start is before it all goes wrong. And because in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, we get God's original intention for humanity there. And if you've been part of the God's Big Picture series that we've been doing in small groups, this is going to be a bit of a recap for you, but that's not a bad thing. It's good to hear what God's initial intentions for humanity was. So, before our reading today, in Genesis 1 and 2, there's this incredible picture built up of the world that God created. Everything is harmonious. Everything works. It's a world that God has blessed abundantly. He's caused it to be a place of rest, and his presence is there. And the biggest part of this blessing of the world that God's created is this. People have a perfect relationship with God. We kind of get the sense that each day he meets with them and he walks with them as someone walks with a friend. God walking with people in a garden. That's an incredible picture. Perfect relationship. But also the picture is this, it's not just God and humanity that have got everything right, it's people as well. Between the man and the woman, there is no barriers between them. Everything is perfect. Adam, on seeing Eve, in probably one of the best things he could have seen in seeing his wife, he said it in chapter 2 and verse 23, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." She was the greatest thing he had ever seen, and he said it, and he got it right. Essentially, he looked at her and he said, "She will do for me. She will do for me." And we get to read that the man and the woman are together and they're naked and they feel no shame. And that's not a weird sexual thing. It's about them being completely and utterly seen by another person and having nothing that they want to hide. There's nothing about who they are that they want to hide from the other person. Physically, relationally, emotionally. It is absolutely perfect. Nothing is hidden. And in the world that they live in, people have a role to play, which is to take the kind of untamed wonder of the world outside Eden and to transform it into something beautiful. They've got a job to do that God wants them to do. He wants them to go out and explore and make the world a brilliant place. It's an idyllic picture. There's just one rule, one test. God says, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you do, you'll be doomed to death. Don't eat it. Just obey me on this. Don't eat it. Enjoy being with me. Enjoy being with one another. Multiply and take the world I've made and make something wonderful out of it. But God's saying, let me be God. Let me be God. And all is absolutely perfect until chapter 3, when that one rule gets tested. The snake or the devil turns up in the garden and tempts Adam and Eve. And if you're wondering at this point, where does the devil come from? That's not part of this passage, so just park that thought for a moment. This is about us and our relationship with God. Because the serpent is going to turn up and he's going to tempt Eve. And where God has said, trust me, trust me and obey me, he's going to try and break that. He's going to try and break it. And the tactic that the devil uses lies behind everything that humanity has ever done wrong. Everything you have ever done wrong, you have swallowed the lie that the serpent says here. They know what the right thing is to do, and they choose to do the opposite. So it's worth looking at how the serpent works, because you'll be able to see it rearing up in your own life, and you'll be able to see it and hopefully resist it. So where we start off with is with the serpent turning up, and he says to Eve, "Did God really say?" And it's kind of got that sense of really about it, a sense of dripping, sneering, ridiculousness about it. In his tone, he's kind of saying to Eve, it's just laughable that God would say a bit of fruit is going to lead to your death. And he subtly, in that one moment, plants the idea in their head, God must have another reason for keeping you away from that fruit. He's not being straight with you. He's got a reason for keeping you away from that. And to begin with, Eve seems to be resolute. So she says, God has said we're not to eat it. But she gives it a kind of embellishment as well. She says we mustn't even touch it or we'll die, which is adding to what God had said a little bit. She made God's laws stricter than what they actually are. We have a tendency to do that as well. And it all just adds to the suspicion that's starting to grow in her mind that God is holding out on humanity. And the devil builds on that. Having planted the idea in her head, he just goes for it. He then says, no, you won't die. You won't die if you eat this fruit. You'll be like God. You'll know good and you'll know evil. Essentially, his argument is this: God is holding out on you. You are missing out. You will have a much better life if you disregard God. It's better to leave God behind. This is what he's saying. He's saying to Eve and Adam, run your own life. Run your own life. And that simple conversation is the motivation behind everything we ever do wrong. Every sin you've ever committed, you have swallowed that lie at some point. Because just break it down in the world that we live in. If you were to go out onto the street and tell people they need to obey what God says, to start off with, you would get the "that's just ridiculous" response. People wouldn't have an argument to start with. They would say things like, it's 2018 for goodness sake, why do we have to listen to a guy in the sky? Why do we have to do that? They just say it's ridiculous. They would say things like this: following God, that'll box your life in. You will miss out. Christianity will spoil your fun. You can make the rules. You can decide how you live your life. And your life will be so much better if you disobey God's archaic rules. You be God. You be God. And it's powerful. That message has stuck in the human heart. It lies behind every sin. Every single one. The suspicion that God does not have your best interest at heart. So every affair that ever happens, people know that it's not right to sleep with someone else's husband or wife, but they'll say, I want this and it feels right. They'll say they know that God says, forgive people. Your life will be so much better if you forgive. But we love holding on to a grudge so that we can punish that person ourselves. We know God says, don't be anxious about anything, but we're not quite sure God's going to get it right if we leave him in control. So we're anxious all of the time. In essence, we're saying, I need to be like God. One of the most powerful slogans in the EU referendum came from the Vote Leave side. Take back control. You probably got sick of hearing it when people are arguing with one another. Now, I'm making no comment on the referendum result. That's way beyond my skill set. But that statement has stuck in the human heart. It's potent. When you're told, take control, you think, yeah, I fancy doing that. It's what the serpent said. It's always in us. We love to be in control and take charge of our own destiny. So the test is, are you going to obey God? Are you going to trust that he knows what's right? And we fail it. We fail it. And the reason we fail it is because we want to fail it. That's the other thing that comes out in Adam and Eve's encounter. Because what they do is they start to look at the fruit and they think, that looks good. It looks attractive. It's good for food. It'll give me knowledge I don't have. And they want it and they take it. Every time you sin, you do it because you want to. Every single time. Even if you regret it afterwards, in the moment, you did it because you want to do it. No one has ever sinned by accident. We do these things because we want to. Even if it's at a deep level, we do it because we want to. In the Garden of Eden, the tree was a test. God was saying life is a gift. Everything is a gift from me. Choose to trust me even when you don't understand. But humanity said, no, we'll take back control. And we've been taking it ever since. But so what? What's the big issue? Why is it so important to obey God? Well, we see it play out why it's so important. If you don't obey God, everything falls apart. If you look at chapter 3 and verse 7, immediately on eating the fruit, their eyes are opened and they realize that they were naked and they want to cover up. Straight away, they want to cover up. Suddenly, they don't want to be quite as well known by the other person as they were before. Immediately, before God's even turned up. And it's not just a physical thing that's going on there. By taking the fruit, both of them have decided we want to be in charge of our own lives. We want to be God. And so actually, they're going to be using other people for what they want from that point onwards. They are the most important person in the world now. And they want to hide that from one another. People want to hide from each other. They're ashamed to reveal everything about who they are to each other. That's what we do as well. That's what we do. That's not the worst of it, though. By verse 8, Adam and Eve hear God walking in the garden. But whereas this would previously been a joyous moment where they would have probably come running out to meet him, now it's a moment of terror. They have to hide. They can't be seen by God anymore. They can't be exposed to his presence. The relationship between man and God is broken. And so if we don't want people to see who we really are, of course we're not going to want God to see us as we really are either. When God does meet them and asks the question, have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to? The answer comes back. And this is the moment where a man does not cover himself with glory. The woman you put here, she gave me some and I ate it. It's her fault. What I really need is a new wife. God, it's your fault. You gave me a defective wife. If you'd given me a better wife, I would never have eaten that fruit. Instantly, he says that. Without a moment's hesitation, he throws Eve under the bus. Now, I bet that's also the first moment in history a wife gave a husband the stink eye. I bet that was one of those moments where she was muttering under her breath, "You complete jerk," at that moment. Any perfect man illusions she had about Adam, they disappeared in that moment. Those words, "this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone," they mean nothing anymore. She's just been thrown under the bus by her husband. And when God speaks to Eve, she's not much better, actually. Her answer is, "The snake deceived me, and I ate." It was still somebody else's fault. They try to move the blame to someone else so it doesn't all fall on them. Neither person has been honest. God's wanting them to own their sin and to own it, and they try and hide it, and they try and deflect it. That's the world we live in. That's us. Every single one of us hides who we really are from everyone else. It's why we hate our personal data being shared. We hate it. There's an advert that's on TV at the moment where it talks about personal data and says that everyone knows about the rash that you've got. We don't want people to know everything about us. It's why we have private browsing on our phones and on our computers, because we want to hide things from those around us. Our messaging apps are all encrypted so no one can read our messages. Maybe there's some good things in this, but it just shows that we like to hide from people. We don't want to be completely known. We have an acceptable face that we show to the world, but at times we think to ourselves, "Oh man, if people really knew me, they would not like me." We are self-centered. We will throw people under the bus if it will get us out of trouble. We don't want to be exposed. There's a cartoon book that I used to read as a little boy called Calvin and Hobbes. And in this, a little boy has got a stuffed tiger who he thinks is alive. And in one particular cartoon, he has borrowed, without asking, his dad's binoculars. He's broken his dad's binoculars. And he is living with the guilt. I think I've got, is it on? Yeah. So he's there. It's at dinner time. And I'm starting to feel that this cartoon is more my life, because I have a little boy who has a stuffed tiger who he thinks is alive, who breaks things. But he's sitting there at dinner, and the dad, even with my glasses on, I look like that. So the boy's thinking, look at Dad calmly eating his dinner as if nothing was wrong. I know him. His dad radar is beeping like crazy. He knows I broke something. He just doesn't know what. He can't nail me until he knows for sure. He'll just wait. I know him. He's just going to sit there letting me stew in my own guilt. He figures sooner or later I'll crack. Calvin, pass the salt, and the boy's already exploded with guilt. We hate to be exposed. That just shows what we are like. We don't want people to know who we are. If you thought everyone in this room could know you completely, you'd be sitting there like this guy sweating. That's how you would be. That's what you would be like. There are things that we want to hide from everyone around us. We want to hide from God, where we will say to ourselves, I know he knows them, but if I don't kind of look at it, I can think that I'm hiding from God. We all need to admit that's who we are before God. And it will devastate us. It will devastate us. If we admit to ourselves we are completely and utterly guilty, that we are all Adam and Eve, then that's the first step. And it should devastate us, because we live with exactly the same consequences that they lived with. Broken relationships with each other, broken relationships with God, and a world that doesn't work properly. The worst part of what happened to Adam and Eve, take a look at chapter 3 and verse 24. After it all happens, God drives the man out of the garden. There's no way back. And there's an angel there with a sword which is saying, if you try and come back to God's presence, if you try and come back to where he is in and of your own strength, whack. You're going to get hit with a sword, and it's not going to go well. Imagine Adam and Eve looking back at that sight, looking back on God's garden with the sword in the way, probably thinking, how can we ever get back there? How can we fix it? The answer to their question is we have to drop the excuses. We have to own what we do. We have to admit to God that we are rebellious. We are just like Adam and Eve. We deserve to be out of his blessing. Our relationships are all messed up, and there's nothing that we can do to fix it. And that's devastating. We have to get to that point to start with. And then you have to be the Bonnie Tyler song. So you have to admit that you need a hero. You need someone who can step in and undo things and fix them. And there is a hero. There is a hero. If you look at verse 15 of this chapter, there we get the glimpse of the hero of the story. Because when God is talking to the serpent, when he's talking to the devil, he says, one day there is going to be a human being who comes and he takes you down. So he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Someone is going to take the devil down at some point. And for a moment, imagine it's like this. Imagine a cobra was to come into the room. Maybe it's gone into the junior church room. Let's imagine it's in there. And it's heading to where the kids are playing. And it's hissing and it's spitting and there's venom flying all over the place. And someone rushes in and they do the only thing that they can do in the moment. They stamp and they stamp and they stamp on the cobra until it's dead and the danger is gone. But as they walk away victorious, it becomes obvious that while they've crushed the cobra's head, the cobra has struck too. And the venom's in the system and the poison's working its way through, and they crumple to the ground as well. That's the picture of verse 15. Someone is going to take out the devil, but it's going to cost them their life as well. Even as God expelled people from the garden, he said, this is fixable, but it's going to cost a lot. Someone has got to pay the ultimate price. And I think you probably know where this is going by now. But around 2,000 years ago, there was another man in another garden facing another test about a tree. Whereas Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden where God said, obey me and you can live, Jesus faced a test in a garden full of darkness where God said, obey me about the tree, obey me about the cross, and you'll die. Totally a different test in a garden. And Jesus prays about this test as he's facing it. If there is any other way, if there's any other way, let me not have to go through with this. Any other way. But then, with incredible obedience, he says, not what I will, but what you will. Jesus could legitimately have said, it's not my fault. I'm not to blame. Instead, he said, I'll do it. And he laid down his life. The way back to God is not to try harder. It's not to try and obey him and get everything right. It's to see what God did for you. So if you suspect that obeying God will limit your life and that he's holding out on you, look what he's prepared to pay in order to save you. He'll give up his own son. His own son will lay down his own life and he'll suffer for you so that the sword which swung around the entrance to Eden never hits you, but it hits him. Jesus didn't come to cover up our sin as we try to do when we hide. He came to cover the cost of it. That's where we are. And so, no more excuses. Own who you are. You are a rebel who's turned away from God. And even as Christians, we do this over and over and over again. We continue to get it wrong. And we're only going to be saved because someone's come and stamped on the serpent's head and has died on the cross for us. And then, once you grasp that, that's when you choose to obey him. Once you trust in what Jesus has done completely, then you obey him, not out of obligation, but because of what he's done for you. And life will be better. It will be the beginning of Eden being restored. You will have a proper relationship with God. Your relationships with one another can be better. And even though you're still sinful and you're still going to get it wrong, he forgives you. And one day he will set you completely straight. So, today, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep hiding from God? Or are you going to let him see you completely? Are you going to obey him? Are you going to be inspired by Jesus covering your sin? Because that is the first excuse we've got to drop. And Jesus is the reason why. So let's pray. Father God, we would ask this morning that we would be honest with you about ourselves. That we do try to hide from people. Even as followers of Jesus, we hide from one another. We don't want people to see us exactly as we are. And when we get it wrong, we hide from you still. We sometimes feel as if we've got to do something before we can walk back into your presence. Help us to see that it's only because of Jesus that we can do that he has paid the price, that he did crush the devil, and it cost him his life. And we ask that we might be people who now obey you, not because we feel obligated to, but because we're amazed that the God of heaven would give up his own son for us. So help us to be honest, to own our failures, but also look to the one who covers them. And we ask this in his name. Amen.